Hi, I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. 2 days ago, my daughter-in-law released a podcast episode. Not Taylor, the other one, Kylie. If you have seen it, you know what it was. Kylie sat down and talked about being asked over and over and over for 8 years when she is going to have a boy, 4 daughters, Wyatt, Elliot, Bennett, Finley, and a question that will not stop coming. She said she does not need one. She said the pressure is strange, and she is finished with it. And then she did the thing that everybody has been quoting for 2 days. She apologized. To boy moms. In her way, which is the way that is half a joke and entirely serious. It has been everywhere. People have written about how refreshing it is. Somebody sent me a piece calling it her most personal episode. They are right that it was personal. They have no idea how personal. Because 8 days before Kylie Kelce sat down at that microphone, Taylor Swift asked her a question in my kitchen in Cleveland, Ohio. One question. I was standing at the sink with my back to them, drying a pan I had already dried, because I had realized about 4 seconds earlier that I needed to not be in that conversation, and there was nowhere for me to go. And Taylor asked it. And Kylie Kelce, who has been interviewed hundreds of times, who has her own show, who has been asked every conceivable version of every question about her body and her family for the better part of a decade, Kylie put down her glass and did not say anything for about 6 seconds. And then she said, "Nobody has ever asked me that." 8 days later, she recorded that episode. She has not said why. She will not say why. She said one thing on that podcast that nobody caught, right near the beginning, and if you go back and listen to it, you will hear it, and it will not mean anything to you. It means something to 3 people. Me, Kylie, and Taylor. So I am going to tell you what the question was. And I am going to tell you why Taylor asked it, which has to do with something that started happening to her about 4 weeks ago, that she was not prepared for, and that nobody warned her about. And I am going to tell you what Kylie said back, the whole answer, not the podcast version, the kitchen version, because the kitchen version has a part in it that Kylie will never say out loud on a microphone, and she has given me permission to say it here, and I asked her 3 separate times because I wanted to be sure. Fair warning, this one has some hard things in it. Nothing is wrong with anybody. Everybody in this story is healthy and fine. But there are some hard things in it, and I want you to know that going in. Part 1. What started happening to Taylor. Let me set the scene, because you need about 4 weeks of background. Taylor and Travis got married on July 3rd, 50 days ago as I record this. And for about the first 3 weeks, the coverage was what you would expect: the dress, the guests, Paul McCartney, Adam Sandler, the trees they somehow got into Madison Square Garden. And then, somewhere around the 4th week of July, it turned. I noticed it before she mentioned it. I notice these things because I have spent 3 years reading everything anybody writes about my family, which is a habit I would not recommend to anybody and which I cannot stop. The question started. You know the question. Every married woman on this earth knows the question. When are you having a baby? It started small. A line at the bottom of an article. Somebody speculating about a timeline. Somebody doing arithmetic about her age. She is 36. And using the word window, which is a word I have come to hate. Then it got bigger. By the first week of August, there were pieces about it. Actual pieces. About whether she would, when she would, what it would mean for her career, whether the marriage was the next step toward, that phrasing, toward, as though a wedding is a hallway. And then on August 12th, she was photographed in London in a purple dress at a friend's wedding, and within about 9 hours somebody had written a piece about whether she looked pregnant. I want to stop on that for a second. A woman went to her friend's wedding. She wore a dress. Somebody took a picture of her on a street without her permission. And a person sat down at a computer and wrote about the shape of her body. She was 50 days into a marriage. She did not say anything about it. She has not said anything about anything since July 3rd. I have talked about that elsewhere and I am not going to repeat it here. But she called me on the 13th. And in the middle of an entirely ordinary conversation about entirely ordinary things, she said, without any lead-in at all, she said, "Donna, does it stop?" I said, "Does what stop?" And she said, "The asking." Part 1.5. Who told her to ask Kylie? There is a piece I skipped and I need to go back for it, because it is the part that makes this a story about a marriage, and not just a story about two women in a kitchen. Taylor did not think of Kylie. Travis did. I found this out on the 18th, 4 days after the kitchen, when Travis called me from Kansas City about something else entirely. We had been talking about camp being over, and about his knee, and about nothing, and then he said, "Hey, did Taylor go to Cleveland?" And I said, "On the 14th. Kylie came." And he said, "Good. Just good," in a very specific tone. And I said, "Travis." And he said, "What?" And I said, "What do you mean, good?" He told me. He said Taylor had called him on the 12th, or the 13th. He was not certain. She calls him every day, they have not missed one in 50 days, and the days blur. And he said she had been off. He said, not upset, just, she was doing the thing where she's very calm and very pleasant, and there's something running underneath it. He said, she'd been like that for about a week, and I'd been letting it go because I figured she'd get to it. He said, and then that night she said something about an article. I said, which one? And Travis said, the one about her body. He said, and Mom, I got so angry I had to stand up. He said, I was in the dorm. I stood up in a cinder block room in Missouri, and I could not think of one single thing I could do about any of it. He said, I can't sue anybody. I can't say anything, because if I say anything, it's a headline and it makes it worse. I can't be there. I'm in a dormitory in Missouri and she's in England. He said, and I'm supposed to be. I'm her husband. That's supposed to mean I can do something. He said, so I asked her what she needed, and she said she didn't know. And he said, and that's when I thought of Kylie. I said, why Kylie? And my son said, because Kylie's been getting it for 8 years. He said, I've watched people ask my sister-in-law about her uterus at family functions, at Christmas, in front of the kids. He said, and she handles it every single time, and I've never once asked her how she does it. Then he said, and I thought, if there's one person on this earth who knows what Taylor's feeling right now, it's a woman from Delaware with 4 daughters who's been answering that question since 2019. He said, so I said, call Kylie. And Taylor said, I can't just call Kylie. And Travis said, and I laughed out loud when he told me this. He said, I said, yes, you can. That's the whole thing we fixed. Remember? November? The dinner? We fixed that. And she said, right. And he said, so call her. And Taylor said, I'd rather do it in person. And he said, then go to my mother's house. She'll come. I sat in my kitchen holding the phone. I said, you arranged this. And Travis said, I didn't arrange anything. I said 2 names. Then he said, Mom, that's the only thing I could do from a dorm room in Missouri. I couldn't fix it. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't be in the room. He said, the only thing I had was that I know who the right person is. And I want to say something about that, because I think it is the single most underrated thing a husband can do, and almost nobody counts it. He could not solve it. There was no version of that week where Travis Kelce solves a problem involving strangers writing about his wife's body. What he had was a piece of information that his brother's wife has been standing in that exact place for 8 years, and the instinct to hand it over instead of trying to be the answer himself. That is not romantic. Nobody writes about that. It is, I think, most of what being married actually consists of. Knowing who the right person is, when the right person is not you. Part 2, the 14th. She came to Cleveland the next day, August 14th. She had flown in from London that morning, and she was going somewhere else that evening, and she came to my house for 4 hours in between, which she does now, which I still cannot entirely process. And this is the part that matters. Kylie was there. Not by coincidence. Taylor had asked me on the phone the night before. She said, "Is there any chance Kylie could be there?" And I said, "I'll ask her." And I called Kylie at 10 o'clock at night and said, "Can you come to Cleveland tomorrow?" And Kylie Kelce, who has 4 children under 7, and a podcast and a job at ESPN, and a foundation and a household, said, "What time?" She did not ask why. She did not ask what it was about. She said, "What time?" She drove from Philadelphia, 6.5 hours round trip, in one day, with Finley, who is 17 months old, and who spent most of the afternoon methodically removing every item from a low cupboard in my kitchen and placing them on the floor in a line. So that is the room. My kitchen in Cleveland, Ohio, August 14th, a Friday, about 3 in the afternoon. 4 people in it. Me, at the counter. Kylie at the table. Taylor at the table across from her. And a 17-month-old on the floor conducting an inventory. And I want to describe what it looked like before anybody said anything important, because I think it is the whole point. They were talking about a car seat. I am completely serious. The most famous woman alive and a woman from Delaware who married an offensive lineman were having a detailed practical conversation about a specific model of car seat, because Taylor had asked about it. Because Taylor asks Kylie practical questions constantly, because that is what their relationship actually consists of. Nothing about that afternoon looked like anything. Then Finley found the cupboard, and the conversation drifted, and there was a gap. And in the gap, Taylor said, "Can I ask you something?" Part 3. The question. Here is where I turned around and started drying a pan I had already dried. Because I heard the change in her voice, and I understood that whatever was coming was not mine, and there is no way to leave a kitchen gracefully when you are the person who lives there, so I did the only thing available and became extremely interested in a pan. Taylor said, "Can I ask you something?" And Kylie said, "Yeah." And Taylor said, she said, "When people ask you when you're going to have a boy, what does it do to you?" 6 seconds. I counted them, standing at that sink with my back turned, because the silence went on long enough that I started counting. And then Kylie Kelce said, "Nobody has ever asked me that." I want to explain why that is remarkable, because if you do not follow this family, it might sound like an ordinary question. Kylie has been asked about having a boy in public, on the record, by professional interviewers, dozens and dozens of times. It has been a running feature of her public life since roughly 2019. She has answered it every time. She has answered it well. She has been funny about it. She has been sharp about it. She has been direct about it. She said in January of last year that people put a strange pressure on the idea that Jason is supposed to have a boy, and she pointed out, correctly, and with some irritation, that their daughters play catch with him constantly, and he is fine. Hundreds of times. And in all of those hundreds of times, every single person asked her some version of, "Are you going to have a boy?" Not one of them asked her, "What does it do to you when we ask?" Nobody had ever moved the question 1 inch to the left. Part 4. What she said. I am going to give you Kylie's answer as accurately as I can. She has read this part. She has approved this part. She corrected 2 things in it, and I have fixed them. She said, "It depends on the day." She said, "Most days it does nothing. Most days it's like weather. Somebody asks, I say something, it's over." Then she said, "But there are days." She said, "The bad version is when somebody asks it in a way that means they think I'm not finished." She said, "Because I am finished. I have 4 children. I made 4 entire people. And there's a way people ask this question that carries a little assumption in it, which is that the project isn't complete yet. She said, and I'll be standing there having just gotten 4 children into a car, which, by the way, takes 22 minutes. And somebody will smile at me and say, "Gonna try for a boy?" And what I hear is that all? Then she said, and it isn't all. It's a lot. It's the most it has ever been. And then she stopped. And she said, "Can I tell you the actual answer?" And Taylor said, "Yes." Part 5. The part that is hard. Kylie has spoken publicly about this. In 2024, she said it out loud in a video because she had gotten fed up with pregnancy speculation. Before Wyatt, her first, she had a miscarriage. She went in for a 13-week ultrasound and there was no heartbeat. That is what she said publicly, in 2024, in about 2 sentences, and then she moved on and has essentially never revisited it. Here is what she said in my kitchen on August 14th. She said, "The thing about the question is that it assumes it's a decision." She said, "Everybody who asks it thinks they're asking about a preference, like I'm choosing between 2 things on a menu." She said, "And what I always think, every single time, and I have never said this to anybody, is," she said, "I don't have 4 daughters, I have 5 children. I stopped drying the pan." She said, "I don't say that. I never say that. Because the second you say it out loud, people don't know what to do with their faces, and then you have to manage them." She said, "But that's what's in my head every time somebody asks me if I'm going to try for a boy." She said, "I'm thinking about a 13-week ultrasound in a room in Philadelphia where a technician went quiet." She said, "And I'm thinking, you're asking me if I want more, and I don't think you understand that I already know exactly how much this can cost." Nobody said anything for a while. Finley took a colander out of the cupboard and put it on the floor at the end of her line. And then Kylie said, "And this is the part that I have not been able to stop thinking about for 8 days." She said, "And the other thing is, I'm not sad." She said, "I want to be really clear, because people hear that and they decide you're carrying something. I'm not carrying it. It was a long time ago, and I have 4 children, and I am the happiest I have ever been in my life." She said, "It just lives in the same drawer as the question. That's all. Somebody opens that drawer, that's what's in there." She said, "And the drawer gets opened by strangers, in supermarkets, about twice a month, for 8 years. Part 6. Why Taylor asked. Taylor did not say anything for a long moment. And then she said thank you, and she said it in a way that I am not going to try to describe. And then she said, "I need to tell you why I asked." She said, "It started about 4 weeks ago." She said, "And it's not the same as yours. I want to say that first, because it isn't, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend I know anything about what you just said." She said, "But they've started." And Kylie said, "I saw." Taylor said, "I got married 50 days ago and I have not said one word in public since, and there are people writing about my body." She said, "Somebody looked at a photograph of me at my friend's wedding and wrote about my stomach." She said, "And the thing is, I've had my body written about since I was 17. That is not new. I am extremely used to that, and I have made my peace with it in a way that took about a decade, and that I'm not going to explain." Then she said, "This is different." She said, "Because now it's not about how I look. It's about what's supposed to be inside me." She said, "And I don't know how to feel about it, because I don't have an answer to give them." She said, "And I've realized over the last 4 weeks that I don't actually know whether I don't have an answer because I haven't decided, or because I've decided and I'm not telling anybody, or because it's nobody's business and I'm allowed to just not." She said, "And I've never in my life been unable to sort out my own opinion about something." Then she said, "So I wanted to ask somebody who has been standing in it for 8 years." And she looked at Kylie. And she said, "How do you not let it get into you?" Part 7. What Kylie said back. Kylie thought about it, and then she gave an answer that I have thought about probably 40 times since, and that I am going to give you in full. She said, "You don't." She said, "It gets in. There is no version where it doesn't get in. Anybody who tells you they've got a technique for it is either lying or they've only been doing it a year." She said, "What you get to decide is where it goes once it's in." Taylor said, "What does that mean?" And Kylie said, "It means it's going somewhere. It's going into your marriage, or it's going into your work, or it's going into the drawer." She said, "For the first 2 years it went into my marriage. I was short with Jason about things that had nothing to do with Jason. I'd come home from a supermarket furious, and he'd ask me what was wrong, and I'd say nothing, and then be unpleasant for 2 hours." She said, "That's where it went. Straight into a man who had done nothing." Then she said, "So I moved it." Taylor said, "To where?" And Kylie Kelce said, "To a microphone." She said, "That's what the podcast is." She said, "Everybody thinks I started that show because I like talking. I do like talking, but that is not why I started it." She said, "I started it because I needed one place where the thing could go that wasn't my husband and wasn't my children." She said, "And now when somebody asks me in a supermarket, I don't have to do anything with it. I just put it in the box and take it to work on Thursday." And then she said the thing. She said, "You don't have that right now." Taylor did not say anything. Kylie said, "You've gone quiet. I don't know why, and I'm not asking. But you've gone quiet, and that means you have got nowhere to put anything, and it's been 50 days, and they've just started on your body." She said, "So where's it going, Taylor?" Part 8. What I did. Here is where I did the second worst thing I have done this year. I turned around. I had been at that sink for 11 minutes with my back to a conversation I had no business being inside of, and Kylie asked that question, and I turned around because I wanted to see Taylor's face. And she saw me turn around. And whatever she was about to say, she did not say. She said, "It's fine. It's going where it goes." And the conversation moved. I have thought about that for 8 days, and I want to say something about it, because I said in another one of these that the tactful thing and the kind thing are almost never the same, and I have now demonstrated the reverse failure. Sometimes you should stay at the sink. There was an answer coming. I could hear it coming, and I turned around, because I am a nosy 73-year-old woman who wanted to watch my daughter-in-law's face, and the answer went back in. I do not know what she was going to say. I will probably never know. That is entirely my fault, and it is the cost of being a person who cannot resist looking. Part 8 and a half. What I did not say in that kitchen. There is something I did not say on the 14th, standing at that sink with a dry pan in my hands, and I want to say it now. Between Jason and Travis, there are 2 years. Jason was born in November 1987. Travis was born in October 1989. 23 months. That is a perfectly ordinary gap. Nobody has ever asked me about it, and there is nothing remarkable about it, and I have never had a reason to explain it. Here is what was in those 23 months. In the spring of 1988, I was pregnant. It did not go past 10 weeks. I want to be careful about how I say this because I do not want anybody to think I am claiming something enormous. It was very early. There was no 13-week ultrasound and no technician going quiet. There was a Tuesday, and then there was not. Ed knew. Ed was there. My mother knew, because I called her. And that is the complete list of people who have ever known until this moment, because I have not told my sons, and I have not told my daughters-in-law, and I did not say a word about it in that kitchen on the 14th while Kylie Kelce was saying the hardest thing she has ever said out loud to a woman she has known for 2.5 years. I want to explain why I did not say it. Not because it was too painful. I want to be honest, it is not painful anymore. It was painful for about a year, and then it was sad, and then it became a fact. And by 1995, it was something that had happened to a younger woman I used to be. I did not say it because of a rule I did not know I had. The rule is, do not put your thing on top of somebody else's thing. Kylie was talking. Kylie was saying something she has never said. And there is a move that people make in that situation. I have watched people make it my whole life. I have made it myself, where somebody tells you a hard thing and you immediately say, "Me too," and it feels like solidarity. And what it actually does is turn the conversation around and point it at you. So I stayed at the sink, and then I turned around at exactly the wrong moment for exactly the wrong reason, which I have already confessed to and am still annoyed about. But I want to say the thing about 1988 now, in front of everybody, for one reason. When Kylie said I don't have 4 daughters, I have 5 children, I knew what she meant instantly. Not sympathetically, not as an outsider understanding something. Instantly. In my body. In about a quarter of a second. I have 2 sons, and I have had 3. I have never once said that out loud in 38 years, and I do not entirely know why I am saying it now, except that a woman drove 6.5 hours to my house and said hers, and it seems poor form to let her be the only one. Jason, Travis, and one in the spring of 1988 that we did not name because it did not occur to us that you could.
Ed, if you are listening to this,
I know. We have not talked about it since about 1994. I am not asking to talk about it now. I just did not want her to be the only one who said it. Part 9. The Drive. Kylie left at about 6. I walked her out to the car. Finley was asleep before Kylie got the door closed, which is apparently the whole point of a 6.5 hour round trip. And Kylie stood by the car door and said, "Is she all right?" I said, "I think so." And Kylie said, "Donna, she asked me a question in there that nobody has ever asked me." I said, "I heard." And she said, "I've done maybe 400 interviews." I said, "I know." And she said, 400 interviews and a woman who has known me for 2.5 years is the first person to ask what it does to me. Then she got in the car and drove 6.5 hours home. She called me from the road at about 9. She said, "I'm going to do something." I said, "What?" And she said, "I'm going to answer it." I said, "Answer what?" And Kylie Kelce said, "The real question. On the show." She said, "She asked me what it does to me." Nobody's ever asked, and I've been sitting in this car for 3 hours thinking, if nobody's ever asked me, then nobody's ever asked any of them. She said, "There are women driving cars right now who got asked that in a supermarket this week." She said, "And nobody's ever asked them either." Part 9.5, the 4 of them. I want to tell you about my granddaughters, because they are the actual subject of Kylie's podcast episode, and they have been a background detail in this story for 20 minutes, and that is not right. Wyatt is 6. She is the eldest and she behaves like it. She takes instructions with enormous seriousness. At the wedding rehearsal, she stopped in the middle of the aisle at Madison Square Garden to ask Taylor a question about a cake, which I have told elsewhere. She is the one who will run this family in about 30 years, and everybody knows it, including her. Elliot is 5. Elliot is the one who holds things. At the wedding, she carried a bouquet for 6 hours and did not put it down once, including while asleep in a chair. Elliot is going to be the person who remembers everything. Bennett is 4. Bennett is a negotiator. Bennett wore a jersey backwards at the wedding on grounds that were entirely her own and would not be moved. Bennett is the one who asked me in a kitchen in Philadelphia last Sunday why Auntie Tay always makes that cake, which is a story I have already told and which I am not going to repeat, except to say that Bennett asks better questions than most adults. Finley is 17 months. Finley was born in March of 2025. Finley's entire contribution to the 14th of August was to remove 9 items from a low cupboard and arranged them in a line on my kitchen floor, in an order that I could not decode, and that she clearly could. 4 girls. And when people ask Kylie if she is going to try for a boy, that is the group of people the question is being asked about. I want to say something about Taylor and those 4, because it has developed faster than anybody expected. When Taylor married my son on July 3rd, she became an aunt to 4 children. That is a thing that happened legally and instantly, and it is also a thing that happens slowly and does not care about paperwork. The slow version was already well underway. She had been Auntie Tay for something like a year before the wedding. Nobody announced that, nobody decided it. Wyatt started it, the way children start things, and then it was simply what was true. Here is what I have watched over the last 2 years, and it is relevant to everything I have just told you. Taylor is careful with those girls in a specific way. She does not perform aunt. There is a version of a famous woman entering a family with small children, where the children become a kind of accessory, photographs, mentions, a public role. Those 4 girls have never been used for anything. She has never posted them. She has never mentioned them by name publicly in any way I am aware of. She has never let them be part of anything. And privately, she knows all 4 of them completely differently, because they are 4 completely different people, and she has taken the trouble. She knows Wyatt needs to be given a job. She knows Elliot will not answer a question in front of a group, and will answer it perfectly, one-on-one, 90 seconds later. She knows Bennett negotiates, and that the correct response is to negotiate back rather than to give in, because Bennett does not respect anybody who gives in. She knows Finley likes to be handed things. That is not being good with children. Anybody can be good with children for an afternoon. That is doing the homework on 4 individual human beings under 7. I asked Kylie about it once, months ago. I said, "Does it bother you at all, having somebody like that around the girls?" And Kylie said, "Bother me how?" And I said, "I don't know. The scale of it." And Kylie Kelce said, "Donna, my daughters are going to grow up with a woman in their house who built an entire life out of writing things down." She said, "They're going to know that's a job. That's a thing a woman can do." Then she said, "I've got 4 girls, and one of them is going to want something enormous, probably more than one, and they're going to have watched somebody do it up close since before they could read." She said, "No, it doesn't bother me. It's the single best thing that's happened to them." Part 10, August 20th. I want to tell you about those 6 days, because Kylie told me about them on Wednesday, and they were not simple. She did not go home and write an episode. She went home, and she did not sleep properly for 2 nights. She told me, I kept starting it and stopping it. She said the problem was that she could not work out what she was allowed to say. She said, "I've got a rule about the show. The rule is that nothing goes on it that isn't mine." She said, "My kids aren't mine to talk about. They're theirs. My marriage is half Jason's. My family is everybody's." She said, "So what's actually mine?" She said she called Jason into the room on the 2nd night. I said, "What did he say?" And Kylie said, "He asked me one question, and then he left." I said, "What was the question?" And she said, "He said, 'Are you doing this because you want to, or because you feel like you owe somebody?'" She said she sat with that for a day. And then she decided the answer was both, and that both was fine. She said, "I wanted to. And I also felt like a woman drove a question into my kitchen that nobody had ever asked me, and I'd been handed something, and you don't get handed something and then sit on it." Then she had to decide about the miscarriage. She said, that was the actual decision. That was the whole 6 days. She said, because the true version of the episode includes it. If I'm going to tell people what the question does to me, the honest answer has that in it. She said, and I've talked about it once, in 2024, and it took me about 4 days to recover from doing it, and I promised myself I wasn't going to make it a thing I trade on. I said, so why not include it? And Kylie said, because I'd already told the person who needed to hear it. I want to point at that. She said, I told Taylor, in a kitchen, to her face. That was the point. That was the thing that needed to happen. She said, putting it on a microphone doesn't make it more true. It just makes it a product. She said. So I said everything except that, and the everything except that is still 90% of it, and the 10% stays in Cleveland. And then she said one more thing that I want to end this part on. She said, I did think about her the whole time I was recording it. I said, Taylor? And Kylie said, no. She said, the woman in the supermarket. She said, I kept thinking about a woman about my age who's going to get asked this at a checkout on a Tuesday and is going to smile and say something and go out to her car. She said, that's who I recorded it for. She recorded it 6 days later. It went out on the 20th, 2 days ago. You have probably seen it, or seen it written about. She talked about the pressure. She talked about her 4 daughters. She said she does not need a boy, and she is not going to keep going until she gets one. And the assumption underneath the question is strange, and she is done with it. And she apologized to boy moms, in her way, which is half a joke and entirely serious. She did not mention the miscarriage. She did not mention Taylor. She did not mention Cleveland, or my kitchen, or a 17-month-old emptying a cupboard. But she said one thing near the beginning. If you go back and listen, you will hear it, and it will sound like nothing. She said, and I am quoting her from memory, so this is close, but it is not exact. She said that somebody had recently asked her a version of this question that she had never been asked before, and that it had rearranged how she thought about the whole thing, and that she was not going to say who. That is it. That is the whole reference. About 11 seconds. 3 people on this earth know what she was talking about. Now everybody does. Part 11. What Taylor said about it. I called Taylor on Thursday, after the episode went out. I said, did you hear it? And she said, I listened to it twice. And I said, did you know she was going to do that? And Taylor said, no. Then she said, she didn't tell me. She's never mentioned any of it. I said, how do you feel? And there was a pause. And Taylor Swift said, Donna, I asked her that question for me. She said, I want to be honest about that. I wasn't being generous. I was frightened, and I asked somebody who knew more than me. She said, and she took it and turned it into something for about 4 million other women. She said, that's the difference between us. I said, that's not fair to yourself. And she said, it's completely fair. I asked a selfish question, and she gave a generous answer, and then went and made it more generous. And I said, Taylor, she said in my driveway that nobody had ever asked her in 400 interviews. Silence. I said, you gave her something too. You just gave it first and you didn't notice. She was quiet for a moment. And then she said, is that what family is? And I said, what? And she said, everybody handing each other things and nobody noticing. Part 11 and a half. She answered it. I said earlier that I turned around at the sink and an answer went back in, and that I would probably never know what it was. That was true when I recorded the first part of this. It stopped being true yesterday. Taylor called me. Late afternoon. She was somewhere with a lot of wind. I could hear it, and she said, I've got about 4 minutes. And she said, you asked me something on Thursday, and I gave you a bad answer. I said, I don't remember asking you anything. And she said, you didn't. Kylie did. In your kitchen. She asked me where it was going. She said, and I said, it's going where it goes, which is nothing, which is what you say when you don't want to answer. She said, I've been thinking about it for 8 days. And then she said, it's going into the notebooks. I said, the notebooks? I have talked about the notebooks elsewhere. She has been writing since the wedding, and putting none of it anywhere. 2.5 notebooks in 7 weeks. She said, that's where it's been going. All of it. The articles, the thing about my body, all of it. She said, and Kylie asked where it was going, and I panicked, because I realized in about 1 second that I've been putting it somewhere that nobody reads. She said, which sounds fine. It sounds healthy. Write it down, get it out. Then she said, except that's not what I do. She said, what I do is write it down and then send it out, and then a few million people tell me they've felt the same thing, and then it's finished. She said, the sending is not vanity. The sending is the part where it stops being mine. She said, I've written down the last 7 weeks, and none of it has stopped being mine. It's all still in me. It's just also in a notebook now. I said, so what are you going to do? And she was quiet for a second, with wind going past the phone. And she said, I don't know yet. Then she said, but Kylie did the thing. I said, what thing? And Taylor Swift said, she took the exact thing I gave her and she sent it out. 6 days. She didn't sit on it. She didn't wait until the timing was right or until it fit a plan. She said, a woman asked her a question in a kitchen, and 6 days later, 4 million people had it. She said, and I've got 2.5 notebooks in a drawer and a date written on your calendar in pencil. Long pause. She said, she's better at this than I am, Donna. And I said, she's got 4 children. She hasn't got time to be careful. And Taylor laughed and said, that might be the whole answer. Then she said the thing I have been sitting on for a day. She said, I think I've been telling myself that going quiet was generous. I said, it is generous. And she said, it is. It's also convenient. She said, it means I don't have to decide what I think about any of it. I can just say, I'm not talking this year, and put everything in a drawer and call it a gift to my husband. She said, and some of it is a gift to my husband, and some of it is a woman who is 36 and married 7 weeks and does not know what she thinks about the biggest question anybody is asking her, hiding behind a very good reason. I did not say anything for a moment. And then I said, are you going to change it? And she said no. She said the season thing stands. That's real, and I meant it, and I'm not moving. Then she said, but I'd like to stop pretending it costs me nothing. She said, it costs me something. I'd like that to be true out loud at least once. And I said, it's out loud now. And she said, yeah. She said, to you, in the wind, for 4 minutes. And then she said, that'll do for today. Part 12. What I want to say about the question. I want to speak directly now, because I think there are a lot of women listening to this who have been on the receiving end of some version of it. When are you having one? When are you having another? Are you going to try for a boy? Is that all? Don't you want a girl? Isn't it about time? I got it. I got it constantly in the 1980s, when I had 2 boys, and the version I got was, are you going to try for a girl? And what almost nobody knew, including for a long time my own husband, is that between Jason and Travis there were 2 years, and in those 2 years there was something that did not work out, and I was asked the girl question probably 9 times during that period by people who had no idea and no reason to have any idea. I never told any of them. I would smile and say something and go home. That is what women do. That is what women have always done. Somebody opens the drawer in a supermarket, and you close it politely, and you go home and unpack the groceries. Here is what I want to say about that, at 73, after 50 years of it. You are not obligated to answer. I know that sounds simple, and it is not simple, because the question always arrives inside a smile, and refusing a smile feels like an act of war. But you are not obligated. There is no rule that says a stranger gets an accounting of your body because they asked pleasantly. You are allowed to say, I don't talk about that. You are allowed to say, we're all set, thank you. You are allowed to say nothing at all and change the subject and let it be slightly awkward for 4 seconds. And I promise you that the 4 seconds of awkwardness costs you far less than the drive home costs you. I did not know that until I was about 60. I would like somebody to have told me at 30. And there is one more thing, and this one is for the people who ask. I do not think you are cruel. I think you are making conversation. I think the question feels like interest, like warmth, like asking after somebody. But I want you to know what Kylie Kelce said in my kitchen on the 14th of August. She said, it lives in the same drawer as the question. Every woman you ask has a drawer. You do not know what is in it. It might be nothing, it might genuinely be nothing, and she will laugh and answer, and it will cost her nothing at all. Or it might be a 13-week ultrasound in a room in Philadelphia where a technician went quiet. You cannot tell from the outside. There is no way to tell. So do not open it. Ask about anything else. Ask what she is reading. Ask about her work. Ask her, and I got this from a 36-year-old woman in a purple dress who asked it in my kitchen. Ask her what it does to her. That question has apparently not been asked in 400 interviews. Try it and see what happens. Part 12 and a half. Jason heard it in a car. Jason called me on Thursday night. He said, did you listen? I said, twice. And he said, I listened in the car. He said he had been driving somewhere. He did not say where. He is driving a great deal at the moment. He starts calling football games in Europe this season, and there is a whole apparatus of preparation involved. He said, I put it on because I put all of them on. I've listened to every episode of that show since she started it. Then he said, Mom, I had to pull over. I said, which part? And he said, it wasn't a part. It was the whole thing. He said, I've been married to that woman for 8 years, and I have never once asked her what it does to her. He said, I've defended her from it. I've told people to knock it off. I've made jokes about it. I've been extremely supportive about the fact that people ask her. He said, and I have never asked her what it does. There was a long silence on that phone. And then Jason Kelce said, this is twice. I said, twice what? And he said, 2024. The dinner. Kylie sat at a table for 2 hours, sick as a dog, and I had thirds and didn't notice. And my brother had to call her at 1:45 and ask. He said, and now this. Somebody else asked her the question I should have asked in 2019. He said, what am I doing, Mom? I want to tell you exactly what I said to my son, because I thought about it carefully, and I believe I got it right. I said, Jason, you're doing the thing everybody does. I said, you can't see the shape of a room you're standing inside. I said, Kylie has been fielding that question for 8 years, and you have been standing next to her for all 8 of them, and it has become part of the weather. You stopped seeing it because it never stopped. I said, Taylor could see it because she just walked in. I said, that's not a failure of love. That's proximity. He was quiet. And then he said, okay, but it's still twice. And I said, yes. And he said, so what do I do? And I said, ask her. He said, now? And I said, tonight. In the car, whenever you get home. And Jason said, she's asleep by 10. And I said, then tomorrow. He asked her on Friday morning. She told me about it last night, at the end of the phone call I am about to tell you about. She said, he came into the kitchen and asked me what it does to me. She said, 8 years. I said, what did you say? And Kylie Kelce said, I said, I just did 4,000 words on it, were you not listening? And then she said, and he said, I was listening, I want you to say it to me. She stopped for a second. And then she said, so I said it to him. She said, took about 20 minutes. He didn't say anything the whole time. Then he cried, which he does now apparently. Apparently, he's a crier in parking lots and kitchens. This is a new development in a man I've known for 11 years. She said. And then he said, I'm sorry it took somebody else. And I said, it didn't take somebody else. It took 8 years and somebody else. You'd have got there. Then she said, which was a lie, but it was a kind one. Part 13, last night. One more thing and then I am finished. Kylie called me last night. She said, I've been getting messages. I said, about the episode? And she said, Donna, thousands. She said, I've done that show for 2 years. I have never had a response like this. Not close. She said, and they're not about boys or girls or any of it. She said, they're all the same message. And I said, what do they say? And Kylie Kelce said, they say, nobody's ever asked me either. I sat in my kitchen with the phone against my ear. She said, I've read about 400 of them so far. I'm going to read all of them. It's going to take me a week. And then she said, Donna, can you tell her? I said, tell who what? And she said, tell Taylor. She said, tell her that, when she asked me that in your kitchen, she was the first person, and now she isn't. She said, tell her 4,000 women just found out somebody could ask. I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. 8 days ago, in my kitchen in Cleveland, Ohio, with a 17-month-old emptying a cupboard onto the floor, one frightened woman asked another woman a question that 400 professional interviewers had never thought to ask. 2 days ago, that question went out to several million people with the fingerprints filed off it. And there is a woman somewhere listening to this right now who is going to get asked in a supermarket this week. I hope you have somewhere to put it. And I hope somebody asks you what it does to you. Thank you for sitting with me today.